Hello, I'm Toycat, and the UK government has announced that all trains will be returning to public ownership over the next few years, with today's announcement being that that will happen in South Essex. This means that rail services between South Essex and London have become publicly owned for the first time since the 20th century. That's because operator C2C was nationalised today. This is a big deal and probably has you asking what is going to change, and more importantly, when are the fares going to get lower? Because as all British people know, the reason fares are so high is because these operators are making so much profit on us. I mean, have you seen the price of trains? But the answer to this question is actually one that was answered back in April of this year when they nationalised their first service in the southwest. And ignoring exactly how that went, it is worth mentioning that after this happened, they basically came out and said, yeah, I know a lot of people are expecting cheaper tickets, but we can't guarantee lower fares, but we can instead say there's going to be a best fare guarantee, and we're wanting to make buying cheap tickets simpler. This is because, according to railway specialist Tony Miles, there is only a few pence of profit per passenger journey, and in case that sounds insane, it is public information because they're public companies. You can actually see that the amount of, on average, before Great British Railways, the amount of profit on average per journey was about 2%. This means that for every pound spent, they would make about 2p, which did mean if you bought a £100 ticket, they're making about £2. But this means that even if the UK government can run the railways exactly the same as before, the max that they could reduce the price of the ticket by, without changing anything else, is just 2%. So are rail fares going to get 2% cheaper? Well, not exactly. Instead, you might be able to find cheaper tickets sometimes. I would imagine things like split ticketing might become official, but in terms of the general answer, no. The government will be running the services under Great British Railways, and if you're worried about this because you're like, oh yeah, this is the left-wing government getting in and doing this, actually, as a fun fact, this wasn't started by Labour, although you might kind of get that vibe from the fact that the people most angry about it are trade unions. Look at this, all these profits go into overseas companies, but the actual nationalisation of the British Rails started under the 2019 to 2022 Johnson Conservative government. What happened between 2019 and 2022? I'll leave that mystery up to you, but basically they decided that to have a financially sustainable railway, the government needed to take on most of the risk of running these services, and so the time where the operators should have lost the most money and where they all realistically would have otherwise gone under is when they were nationalised and when Great British Railways was founded. However, the private companies and the name still existed, but all of the profit or losses were actually going to the government for some time now, and so that 2% figure is actually money that hasn't realistically been the operators for a while now anyway. They've been running it under a very fixed payment that the government has been providing them, but still, as of today, that no longer needs to be provided to C2C. As of a few months ago, that needs no longer be provided to South Western Railway, and all of the services in the UK will have the exact same thing happen, and the expected savings, again, this is going to blow your mind here, the expected savings are about £150 million, with an M. So yeah, it's good, and ideally this means that also different train services might work together better to reduce delays and cancellations, but in general, this is one of those big ambitions that actually isn't the broad part of what we care about. Indeed, if you care about the idea of cheaper fares, then what you want is not the government owning it or private companies owning it. What you instead want is for the government to pour a bunch of money in, because regardless of who actually owns the railways, there's this really fun graph that I found that actually shows it broken down by individual line. You can see that, like, okay, whether it is First Group that owns the Great Western Railway, or whether it's West Midlands Railways being owned by Nederlands Spoorwegen, the East Japan Railway Company, and Mitsui, regardless of who it is that owns a given railway, I think most people aren't concerned about the 2% of their fare. They're concerned about the 50 or 60%. They're concerned about the fact that they are paying so much for that journey in what feels like, you just jump on a big, long-moving snake and then that snake gets you to your destination 40 minutes later. Why do these things cost so much money? And the answer is that, well, running a railway is very expensive, and the government has, according to this graph right here, tried to subsidise it as little as possible. The railways were built under, or rather the railways were built privately, but the railways had a huge amount of subsidy during the 60s and 70s, and this was seen as a national priority, but as we develop different forms of transport, whether you want to call that road or plane, depending on short or long distance, more and more governments have started to say, like, man, how do we cut down the amount we want to spend? And so this is all 2018 prices, this graph. As you can see, the easiest way to do that was privatization, which worked quite well at first. The problem is they also privatized, it was the people who owned the tracks. So all of the tracks in the country were privatized, and that led to quite a few accidents that people weren't happy with, as it turns out. Cutting money, cutting the costs of providing rail, but also killing people is not an acceptable compromise compromise to most people in this country, and so you can see costs went up. Then they also went up during the 2000 to about 2007, reaching an all-time high of then. And then as as different as cost rises were passed more onto the consumer rather than being absorbed by the companies or by the government, you can see that subsidy has sort of gone down, even as Crossrail and HS2 have to be funded out of this same pool. But basically, yeah, the idea was the government doesn't want to fund the railways, they want railway passengers to do it, whereas rail passengers, the sorts of people who are angry about, private ownership of all these companies, or not even private, but like other government ownership in a lot of cases, say, wait, no, this is a service, just like how, because let's be real, what is the toll to use the M25? What is the toll to use the M1? If we're going between London and Luton, we can either take, again, I think the M1 and maybe the M25 and maybe some dual carriageways in Luton. Our journey will be free in terms of what we pay the government for that, but if we want to use the government's rail service, we have to pay them most of the cost of our journey. Is that fair? Should there instead be a toll for both users, or should it be that the government just says transport is a public good and therefore we're going to fund it? That is the debate that actually underlies this. People have an eternal debate about the train operator profits, like that is the concerning thing, but the actual concerning thing would be, in my opinion, how much of this infrastructure maintenance should be borne by fare-paying passengers versus the government. As someone who uses both trains and cars, I do think it's a little wild that, again, my contribution to maintaining the infrastructure is about 75% when I use the train, and it's about 0%, give or take, depending on how much you want to argue road taxes and petrol, but like it's very, very close to 0% when you use a car, which is a bit strange, right? Obviously, this is hugely controversial if you were to argue that you should pay per mile in the UK, which is why that's not going to happen, but should they do the same with trains? The simple answer seems like yes. I think a lot of people would make the case that, like, look, why are we only spending £7 billion a year? Do you know how much we spend on, like, way more ridiculous forms of government spending? We spend like over 100 billion a year on like pensions as an example, and then we increase that amount by more than 7 billion a year. Why don't we just cut this 7 billion down? Why don't we just increase this 7 billion by a little bit and provide a great and fairly priced, etc., train service to people? And the reason I would say that again, if I'm going to have one last shift here, the reason I would say that isn't a good idea is because ultimately I think that we have a capacity constrained railway. Have you ever been on a train? I don't know what I just did there. Have you ever been on a train, leaving London during peak hours? Have you ever been on a C2C train when it's not the weekend? It is busy. People are coming from South Essex into London and vice versa. At the current fare levels, there are too many people, and usually this would mean a private company would raise the price until you get like some form of balance, but fares have been set by the government for some time, which is the real point I want to make with this video, is that people talk about public ownership and nationalisation, and whether you're a union, whether you're the government, whether you're just someone who's upset that, 2% of your journey is going to the train operator, people talk about this thing as if it's like, yeah, we can solve this exclusively by who owns the railway. But I think it is a far more structural change that needs to be made. And to prove that, I've got this graph for you that I'm going to make on the spot. So everyone agrees, again, there is no debate about, say, Swiss railways. Switzerland has really, really, really good trains. I'm going to try and do a Swiss flag for you right here. Switzerland has really, really good trains. Is it red and white, or is it white and red? I guess logically white and red would be England, so it's going to be red in the middle to be Swiss. Okay, Switzerland has really good trains, right? That is what the Swiss flag looks like, I am fairly sure. Okay, Switzerland. No, I've done England, damn it. I've made an English flag. Yeah, let's try this again then. So everyone agrees Switzerland has really good trains, and also, crazily enough, you might not realize this, but they also have nationalized trains. Whereas we have good trains that are privatized in Japan. You might have very briefly seen, but everyone agrees that JR and the Shinkansen is the balls. It's the bee's knees. It's really good. It's fast. And as you might, a crazy fact is that JR Central actually carries 138 million high-speed rail passengers, which is considerably more than the world's largest airline. That's nuts, in my opinion, that this single company, which is one of many that make up the Japanese railways, because they split it all up when they privatized it, Japan has privatized their train services and it works great. Everyone loves it. It's making shareholders money. It's getting people around the country, and it's actually, and not only that, but they're also working on brand new things like the Chuo Shinkansen is the idea of a maglev line. They are privately funding this. You heard about floating trains? This isn't like, oh, Japan has to stress so much about the 100 billion they're going to spend like we do with HS2. Nah, the private company's building it because they know they'll make that money back. That is that is, in my opinion, the amazingness of Japan's railways, which are both private and good. So we'll put Japan here. Let's hope this is how the Japan flag looks. There we go. So we'll put Japan as an example of nationalized trains, so privatized trains that are great. At least tourists love them. Again, even if it's just from the Western weeaboo sense, people love the trains in Japan. Whereas, then we also have classic examples of nationalized trains that are bad. The easiest one being Amtrak. So I don't know how to draw an American flag off the top of my head. I think it's red, white stripes, right? So it's red and white. And red and white and red and white, and then there's like some blue dots over here. Is that America enough yet? There we go. So you can see that there are bad nationalized services. Amtrak sucks. I've taken it and I enjoy the fact that it takes 20 hours to go. You know, I enjoy it as a sightseeing voyage that it takes 20 hours to get from, I don't know, like I think Chicago to New York is the journey I did. Whereas you could do a pretty comparable journey across Japan in a significantly, I guess really it'd be like tip to tip. It'd probably take you like 7 or 8 hours, but still substantially faster, right? And so basically everyone agrees Amtrak sucks, and I think we could argue all day about other nationalized operators that are bad. Canada would be a strong contender. But then we have the UK, where it was bad and privatized. So the UK is, you know, one of these. I know how to draw a UK flag, trust me. But there's a big problem in the UK that we have, you know, let's do this properly then. So it's a big cross, and then there's a red one in the middle here. There we go, that's the UK. So the UK has a privatized service that is bad, and people think, oh yeah, the way you jump from here to here is you have to go diagonally. But actually, we could have good privatized trains, we could nationalize our trains and keep them bad, as I suspect is actually going to be our plan. The only difference is actually how you're going to actually run the services, and so there needs to be a debate about, okay, how much are the public going to fund? You can put a bunch of money in to make it great, but then that is a continual cost, or you can give the train companies the actual ability to make services profitable, and one of the ways that you could do this is the way that all of the trains were built to begin with. Because, you know, when we talk about C2C, right, we talk about the UK government returning the C2C to public ownership, because before C2C was a private company, it was the government who owned it before that, right? Like, that's a famous fact. But before the government owned it, before C2C, it was a private company who just decided, yeah, actually, I'm just going to build a railway from here all the way out to, I guess, like, the furthest stop I know on C2C is Basildon. They just decided to build a train that far through stuff that already existed, and the reason they decided to do that was because, yeah, we'll make a bunch of money. People will not only want to go from the already existing Basildon to there, but also if we build a bunch of houses right here near this sewer works, if we build a bunch of houses over here just down the road from the sewer works, people will want to live in those houses, because even if we charge 300k for our 200k houses, the alternative is living in £1 million houses in London. Boom, wow. Even if it takes you billions of pounds to build this, the railway line will make you money doubly so. If we gave rail companies permission to do that, if we made infrastructure profitable, it could be great. I think the Elizabeth line is a classic example of like that we built one of the coolest pieces of infrastructure in the world. But then what we did is we took, again, look at this. It's got passenger screen doors. It's some of the longest platforms on the network. Look how nice it looks inside of here. However, the problem was that everyone knew it was coming, and instead of building to new areas and building those up, we built to existing ones. And then, so what happens is all of the gains of this, you know, what is it, like £30 billion infrastructure project? All of the gains go to people who already own property in the area, which means the government is effectively handing Woolwich residents a bunch of money. And, you know, as much as I could have been a Woolwich resident, or I looked at buying in Ilford before that ever came there, but you know, glad I didn't, regardless of the gains they would have gone. The truth is that, like, if you look at, you know, not a lot of people that excited live in Ilford even these days. The truth is that if we have a train system that is there to provide money for making trains, we could do it. But instead, we want a service that is reliable and frequent and consistent. But then we also don't want to pay any money, but that's not a choice. The choice is, do we pay money via our taxes, or do we pay money via our train fares? There's not the choice of, I want trains to run infinitely for free, and so that's my real debate here, is that, like, actually, we could have had good trains while they were private. we could have had, we can have bad trains when they're nationalized. I wouldn't expect us to have the best trains in the world now that we have nationalized them. But I think there's the more important final question to ask here, which is why are the government doing this? And I think the actual answer is like, okay, according to polling done by YouGov, they asked the British people quite regularly what services should be public run and what services should be private run. As you can see, a memeing 3% of people say the police should be private. Weirdly, 5% say the armed forces should be private. Like, I can just about, if you really try to convince me, understand the case for making the police private. You know, like, I think I could, like, understand what you were saying, but the armed forces being private, like what happens? I give the army £1,000, or they're gonna bulldoze my house? I don't understand. I don't understand how people even think of that idea. But anyway, you can see that these are the various industries, and railway companies are one of the most popular industries that should be public sector that currently are not. It's that and water companies, because as a fun fact, police, hospitals, armed forces, and schools already are run by the government, and not even the most conservative or reformer figures would suggest changing that. So water companies and railway companies are the obvious wins for a government returning something to the public sector, and right now we are not in a position to spend a bunch of money to make it that good, but a lot of people are going to go, oh yeah, well, Labour got the trains nationalised, and even people who are very, you know, like, who are quite right-wing are going to be like, yeah, you know, as much as I don't like the idea of the government running things, ultimately that's one of the things they should run. Whereas you see the reverse. Even people who are pro-nationalisation go, yeah, why would we want governments running the banks or airlines? British Airways are a good example of how, like, yeah, you might think that 17%, the best argument they could make is like, well, look at all the profits British Airways makes. That previously was our flag carrier that we owned as a country, and since we privatized it, it has made a bunch of money. Where can we find that? It's in corporate affairs, I'm guessing. So you can see that British Airways made £2.7 billion last year. Why isn't that our government money? We could use that to subsidize the railways, 1/3. But actually, I tend to find the reason that this whole debate is at least a little bit problematic or problem-filled is the idea that, like, yeah, if the airline was public, then we'd have to have funded it during these bad COVID years, which would have been a disaster by itself. And also, you've got to make the assumption that when a service is government-run and private-run, they run at equal efficiency. Does a private company and the government have the same ability to run a company? I think that even if you are quite pro-nationalization, you'd say, no, but the point is they don't. The armed forces could make way more money if they threaten to knock down my house for £1,000 right now. You know, if Keir Starmer needs to raise some money, rather than fiddling income tax, he could just say, yeah, army, you have permission to go to everyone's house in London and ask for £1,000, and they would make a bunch of money, but they're not choosing to do that, right? And obviously, no one wants them to do that. But the point is that, you know, train companies could be making a bit more money, or you know, railway companies are any company that is privately run is going to be quite good at maximizing its income, which maybe you don't like, but also keeping its costs under controls. The more income they have and the fewer costs they have equals the more profit they get to have. You can see right here that, like, you know, British Airways has about 14.5. They've managed to go from like 12 billion with 1.5 billion as profit to 14.5 billion turnover with 2.7 billion as profit. Making that profit is such a big desire, which means that, you know, like, basically as a train company, do you think that the government is going to be as good at keeping their costs under control when there are, you know, strikes threatened? Are the government going to be as good at resolving those strikes in the benefits of passengers as opposed to the benefits of the people, the train employees? Would the train employees much rather have one big entity to rail against rather than, you know, how many is it right now? Like, it's about 18 different governments and 20 different private companies. The truth is that is the actual concern that anyone should have, is can the government keep their costs under control? Can the government run the service as effectively as the private sector? If they can, we saved about, again, optimistically, according to the government themselves, about up to 150 million pounds one time. And if that doesn't work, then we might end up spending a bunch of money And as, I guess, conservative North, the Shadow Rail Minister says here, we are risking successful operations for ideological reasons. Is that what's happening? Yeah. But then I would say, on a slightly populist level, yeah, I guess they should do it. If 76% of people want it to happen, then, you know, we're all willing to spend a bit of money for this one, aren't we? So let's enjoy our new nationalized Great British Rail, but just don't expect it to be substantially better or substantially cheaper, or substantially less for the government to run. You know, what we really should do is we should start building one of these. Let's get a private company involved to do that and see how it goes. That's my radical idea. Look how cool it. Why don't we have floating trains in this country, or even the idea of floating trains? You know, how's that project going that we are working on in the UK? I hear HS2's going real well. I mean, I remember we had these big plans to go to Leeds, Manchester, Crewe. What's it looking like right now? Oh, yeah. I guess we're not doing that good with rail in this country, are we? Anyway, with that said, I hope you all enjoyed this deep rant into rail. I've wanted to do this forever. I feel like I could go for a whole extra 40 minutes talking about how trains can or should be run. And so who's going to stop me? Okay, yeah, just in case you think I'm crazy with my Essex idea, I do need to point out, if you ever looked at a tube map, you'll notice the tube map goes literally outside of London in every definition of that word. Like, there is a tube station here in Chesham. They have their own car park that is run by TfL. So TfL actually has... London as a whole owns quite a few things out of London. It's very, very quirky in my opinion. But what's interesting is, yeah, you got this tiny village in, I think it's Hertfordshire, Buckinghamshire, I guess it would be. We got this tiny village in Buckinghamshire that looks like that sad town centre where you grew up. And it's like, oh yeah, but if you go the right way in this sad town centre where you grew up, you find the tube station. And because this entire town was built by train companies, Metroland, and indeed a lot of this, everything going deep in there, because they're like, yeah, you can take what is currently a field and turn it into a town, and people will want to live there because they don't like expensive cities. I think that rather than just reconfiguring our existing rail lines, the government needs to be like, yeah, new rail line. It goes from London to, throw a dart at a map. Guess what? We got a new train line from London to Howstead. Howstead, do they even have a train station right now? They don't even have a train station right now. So London to Howstead trains, that's that's Halstead, maybe? It's when you're in a part of the UK you don't know, it's so hard to like guess which letters they've decided to stop pronouncing. So I'm gonna go with Halstead. London to Halstead trains with a stop in Stebbing, Great Dunmow, Thorpe Roding, North Weald Bassett, and then, you know, over here, make a brand new town in Norwood End too. There's an Airbnb there. We could use that Airbnb to... It's funny that it's called Airbnb on the map. We could use that Airbnb as the new station building, and then we could build a bunch of houses around it. Solve a lot of problems at the same time, huh? Okay, I'm not going to rant for 40 minutes as much as I want to, but instead, I'll say thank you for watching. I obviously want to talk about the Japanese election. Exit polls are looking spicy, but we'll do that tomorrow, because for now, second channel, don't care, goodbye.